Let's take a look at how this works. Take a working copy of working.c and paste it into our working project and open it up here. Now we've seen the macros that look like this, and that's very common, and it's used to provide something that works like a constant. What we're going to do this time is something that is a little bit more complicated. We're going to define a macro. We'll just call it macro1. And this macro is going to have parameters. And so we'll just call those parameters A and B. And the result of it will simply be A times B. And so if I come down here into the main part of the program and I define an integer, so I'll call an integer this, and I'll say that it's a 5, and I'll call an integer that and give it a 7. And then in my printf, I'll just say this is %d, that is %d, and result is %d. And I'll just put this on the next line for clarity here, and I'll say this and that, and macro1, and pass it this and that. So you remember in C that white space is mostly non-consequential. So putting this on another line doesn't change how it works. I'm just doing that so that it's easier for us to see on the screen here. And so I'll save this and I'll run it. And what do we expect to have happen? We'll get a 5 and we'll get a 7, and then we'll get 7 times 5, which is 35. And there we go. So we got this, we got that, and we got 35. And so you can obviously do things that are much more complicated with a macro like this. It's not uncommon to do something like this. If A is greater than B, then the result will be an A. Otherwise, the result will be a B. And so it'll simply give us the greater of them. And so now our result will be a 7. I'll compile and run that, and we get a 7. And if we change this around to A less than B, then our result will be a 5. So as we use these macros, again, it's important to think about the possibilities of side effects. So it's really common to go ahead and put everything in parentheses, especially when you've got operators here and now you're going to be dealing with operator precedence. You might be doing something like this times that in the beginning of the macro, and then you have to really think, well, what is the result of that going to be? I don't know. What's the precedence? Is it going to evaluate the asterisk first? Is it going to evaluate the less than sign first? I would have to look it up on my handy dandy operator precedence chart to predict it, or I would just run it. But if I were to just put these in parentheses, put the A in parentheses and the B in parentheses and the next A in parentheses and now the next B in parentheses, and then I'll often put the entire thing in parentheses, which I've done here. You can see I've got these parentheses on the outside. And now when I run it, I know that I've got the less than. So I'll get that, I'll get the 7. And if I run that, I get a 7. And if I change this to a greater than, I'll get the 35. Save that and run it. So it's important to think about the side effects. When you're using macros, you need to really think it through. The side effects can be very unexpected and dangerous. So while the use of function-like macros is common in C, and in fact the preprocessor was even designed to do this, for many uses, C++ templates are a superior solution. So if C++ is an available option, templates are generally recommended over parameterized macros. Now let's delete the working files and run clean.